something like your host at the Book Cellar. I'm joined by a couple of my colleagues. They can also help you out, sell you books, tell you where the bathroom is, all that stuff, so don't be a stranger. But tonight we are excited to welcome Shealeigh Voitl to celebrate her new book, State of the Free Press 2026.
Yay!
She's joined by Steve Macek, who is a professor of communication and media studies at North Central College. He'll be leading the conversation tonight.
I guess
Grateful
so.
to have him here as well. Shealeigh Voitl is Associate Director of Project Censored. Project Censored, for those of you who don't know, I suspect probably a lot of you know, is a nonprofit media watchdog organization that focuses on increasing media literacy among Americans, as well as highlighting independent journalism, which this book aims to do. Which takes a bunch of independent journalistic pieces from the last year and analyzes them and goes through them and kind of rates them. But yeah, and Shealeigh, she got her start working with the project at North Central College alongside Steve Macek. You can find some of her other writing at Truth Out, The Progressive, Miss Magazine, among other places. She lives here in Chicago, and we're very grateful to have her, as well as Steve, here tonight to talk about the state of independent journalism. What better time? So yeah, I'll stop talking. Without further ado, Steve Macek and Shealeigh Voitl.
Thanks, Jack. Thank you all so much for being here on this very frigid Chicago evening. Thank you so much to the Book Cellar for hosting us tonight. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much, Steve, for joining me. This is very full circle. As Jack mentioned, I was a North Central student. I got my start with Project Censored in Steve Macek's classroom at North Central. So it was really special to be joined by Steve for this event tonight to celebrate 50 years of Project Censored and our book, State of the Free Press 2026. Project Censored is in its 50th year. It was founded by Carl Jensen at Sonoma State University. And yeah, as Jack mentioned, we're a nonprofit organization that focuses on critical media literacy education. And yeah, since 1976, I and my many colleagues before me have fiercely championed independent journalism, which you'll see represented repeatedly throughout this book and many other volumes before. We've developed critical media literacy curricula for high school and college students, and we've published several books on media analysis and institutional censorship through our publishing and print Censored Press. And when we talk about censorship, we're not talking solely about the suppression of information. We're also thinking about the structural forces, including corporate ownership, advertising dependence, elite political access, and institutional biases that systematically marginalize critical perspectives. So tonight we'll be talking just a bit about this book here, the underrepresented or underreported stories in this year's list by intrepid independent journalists from all over the country. We'll be talking about some of those stories. Steve will also talk about his contributions to the Deja Vu chapter, which looks back at past top censored stories and developments and updates to those stories in the years since. And then I'll talk a little bit also about Junk Food News chapter, which I co-authored this year. It's a term that we use to describe sensationalized tabloid stories that are so good to read, but then you realize that it maybe is distracting you from news that affects our daily lives. And so we'll talk about all that, and then we'll have hopefully some time for some questions. But I'll let Steve introduce himself.
So again, I'm Steve Macek. I'm a professor of communication and media studies at North Central College. I became aware of Project Censored through its annual yearbook. It's been releasing a book that is a collection of underreported stories as well as essays of media analysis since the 1990s. I became aware of it as a volunteer at a left-wing bookstore in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on the West Bank, which is where some activity has been taking place recently. And we always would get the book in every year, and it would always be like one of our best sellers. Like, you know, it was anything by Noam Chomsky, and then the Project Censored annual yearbook. And when I started teaching courses on media literacy, news analysis, and media criticism, I started assigning the book. And eventually I became, got to know the people behind the project, and they invited me to get my own students involved in doing research that contributes to the annual list that's released of the most important, significant stories that are overlooked or underreported by the corporate media every year. So probably for about 10 years now, I have been enlisting students that take my upper level seminar on media criticism I've been offering them the chance to research stories. As we call it the Campus Affiliates Program at Project Censored. They research stories, nominate stories they think are important that haven't gotten the attention that they deserve to the project. Those stories then go on to a big ballot that is sent out to our international panel of judges, and it is truly international. We have a judge in Japan, we have a couple of judges in Germany. We used to, when I first started, have a judge in Chile and a judge in Spain. They review all of the stories, they vote on them, and then rank them, and then we, people working with the project, me and others, and my students, kind of revise them for publication. And then Shealeigh now, who's now co-director of the project, expertly copy edits them and corrects all of our errors. And I have to say, she is a wonderful copy editor. Excellently reviews them, copy edits them, and then they make it into this book. I thought, since am I supposed to be leading this conversation, I would throw out a question for Shealeigh. So what kinds of stories end up in the book, and what are some important stories that are included in this year's book that you think deserve more attention from the big national corporate media?
Well, every year we see patterns represented. Every single year we see patterns represented throughout the list of stories, or the list that students are eager to investigate. A lot of those stories are environmental and about labor rights. A lot of those stories recently have been about big tech and data privacy. This year, I think particularly, there were a lot of, there were stories about ICE surveillance. There was one story that I'd like to talk about because it highlights Chicago reporting. Specifically, it was our number 8 story this year, and it was a joint report by Boltz and a Chicago-based nonprofit newsroom, and Justice Watch. And that was in 2024. It found that in 2023, CPD made 200,000 undocumented traffic stops, violating a 2003 state law requiring law enforcement agencies to report specific details of every traffic stop to the Department of Transportation. And this was sort of paired for the top censored story list with a Truth Out report that found that in 2024, U.S. police killed an average of nearly 4 people each day, making it the deadliest year since Mapping Police Violence, who compiled this report, since they began collecting data in 2013. Black and Indigenous people were disproportionately targeted, and a majority of the killings happened when police were responding to nonviolent offenses, so making this, these thousands of undocumented traffic stops all the more troubling. And I think that is the huge importance of community local reporting. We are in a modern media ecosystem of news deserts where there is a loss of local reporting infrastructure and community voices and community grief and issues are not being, represented. And yeah, I mean, these stories were, in terms of, the New York Times, Washington Post, a lot of national corporate outlets did report on, dangerous interactions between police and motorists, but not this particular stop that made all the more troubling Chicago police making these undocumented traffic stops and the implications of those. So yeah, we see these patterns sort of corruption and different kinds of oversight, but it's just really, it's amazing. We're celebrating our 50th cohort of students, and I was in one of those, and I've seen just like the curiosity of college students who are really are submitting these VINs that are so well researched.
And can you explain for the audience
Yes,
what a VIN
A VIN is, yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry. It's what we call a validated independent news story. So Steve assigned it in my class that I took with him, media criticism. A lot of different professors have different approaches. We sort of have the freedom to investigate whatever we were drawn to. Project Censored has a list of independent news sources on our website, projectcensored.org. And they're organized.
Projectcensored.org.
But it's organized sort of by beat. Again, environmental, labor, big tech, and you're sort of free to roam. We have one professor at UMass Amherst, Allison Butler, who assigns stories or assigns students. They have to investigate something within education, and she assigns it within groups too. So students kind of get together and try and figure out what story they'd like to pick apart. But it's really great. I mean, I feel like I learned something new every day during VIN season, and some of it is really bleak, but it's just reminds me all the time of the importance of local, quality, independent journalism, which especially rural areas in the United States are not able to have easily accessible anymore. So yeah.
Well, I thought I might talk about, because a number of the stories in this year's book were researched by my students, Shealeigh, North Central College students who working with me sort of under my direction. And one of the stories is the number 2 story in the book. Water scarcity threatens 27 million people in the United States. And this was a story that was originally reported in a very niche environmental news site called New Lead, spelled L-E-D-E. Has anyone here ever heard of it? New Lead. It is a very small environmental, it's like a 2 or 3 person show. And the story is based on a study that was done by the U.S. Geological Survey about water scarcity and water stress that found that 27 million people in the United States live in areas where they may not have access to enough water to sustain life. That was the criteria. And it's a U.S. government agency who did the research, right? Put together this report, and they found that they found a number of causes for this water scarcity. Were that first of all, water pollution was contaminating water supplies. And a lot of the water pollution was caused by agriculture. So it was nitrous or phosphorus pollution in the water. Runoff from agricultural fertilizers. That may be jeopardizing people's access to potable water, drinkable water, usable water. Moreover, the study itself found that global climate change had a huge impact on people's access to water. First of all, many parts of the U.S. have been for many years in drought conditions. For example, the state of Utah, the entire state of Utah back in 2024 was under drought conditions, parts of Texas, parts of Florida. So, and these droughts are being, of course, there are normal cycles of droughts, but they're being caused primarily by global climate change. Not only that, but climate change makes hurricanes and storms more, more violent, more destructive, and they destroy the infrastructure that people need to get access to drinking water. So this report, which is issued by the U.S. Geological Survey, a U.S. government agency, you would think would get a lot of attention, right? 27 million people is a significant portion of the total U.S. population. No. Only New Lead and then a couple of other environmental news sites picked up and reprinted the New Lead report, gave a thorough report of the study, and then Newsweek magazine, which is not the Newsweek magazine that it once was, where it had a very high circulation. It is purely online. It's now basically a non-profit commercial website. That was the only national publication that reported on this study. And as we point out in the summary, as Ella Morovka was my student who looked at the original reporting and then followed up on it and wrote up a lovely summary for the book, as she points out, 5 months after the study was released, it was released in like January, 5 months after the study was released, the Trump administration closed down 25 centers of water science run by the U.S. Geological Survey, which means, and these are the centers that monitor flooding and water access around the country. So what that means is we may not get another one of these surveys. We might not get another one of these studies documenting how little access so many millions of people in the U.S. have. That's the kind of story we see all the time, and that makes it onto our list all the time. For whatever reason, the corporate news media do an awful, awful job of documenting environmental issues. And we can talk about why that is, of reporting on environmental stories. I mean, I think there are other kinds of stories that they also systematically fail at reporting. Yeah. Stories about abuses of power, either by the military, by police forces. Yeah. Those also go often underreported. Stories about, as you said, labor rights and the working class and conditions of the working class often go underreported. But this one really stood out to me from this year's book.
Yeah, and I think also like what's important too about the media analysis portion of the end of each summary is pointing out that sometimes the stories are reported by the corporate news media, whether it's the New York Times or MSNBC or Fox or whatever, but it's an angle that completely misses sort of the central point and the central implication to why it's causes long-term stress, like obviously what you
yeah, no, I think the Newsweek piece was just like 3 paragraphs. Yep. And then a map. It had an infographic, but that was it. As opposed to the independent journalist who did a very in-depth, detailed report on that same issue. And that is what we think of as one of the big problems with the corporate media. What we consistently find every year as we're compiling this list is that the corporate media may touch on some of these issues, but they do not explore them in the depth to which they merit, right?
Although they have the resources.
And they have many more resources, right? Yeah, they
Yeah.
have newsrooms of hundreds of people,
Right.
whereas the New Lead has a newsroom of 3 people.
Yeah.
Is there any other story in the on this year's list?
I know you have. Yeah, I know you have another one that you'd like to talk about too.
I do, because it was also researched by North Central. I mean, I'm going to sheepishly.
We have 2 other
sheepishly
North
admit,
Central alums.
we've got other North Central. Another North Central alum. Sheepishly admit, yes, because it's another North Central student. So this was a story that was researched by my student Nicole Mendez Villarrubia, who actually has contributed stuff to the project over a couple of years. She's now graduated, so she's a North Central alum. and this was the 10th story on this year's list, working class severely underrepresented in state legislatures. And this was taken from a magazine for state government employees called State Line. So if you work for the state of Illinois, or for some agency, state of Illinois, state of Indiana, state of Wisconsin, your office might subscribe to this magazine. The story is based on research by two political science professors, one here at University of Loyola, and the other one at Duke University, about the representation of the working class in state legislatures. How many either representatives or senators in state legislatures have a working class background? And what they found was, looking at 7,400 individual elected officials at the state level, only 116 were from a working class background, which they defined as somebody who currently or last worked in manual labor, the service industry, clerical, or labor union jobs. Only 1.6% of representatives in state legislatures are working class. That's whereas if you look at the total workforce, over 50% of the U.S. workforce work in jobs that fall into this definition of the working class. Now, we can quibble about that definition of working class. I might define the working class in a way that it would have even more of the population classified as working class. But that story was not picked up by any big, corporate news outlet. None of this was not mentioned by any in any news story published by the big corporate media. What was interesting is that in some opinions columns published in the Washington Post and the New York Times, the findings of this study were alluded to. Now, why is it important that the working class is so underrepresented in state legislatures? Well, state legislatures make all sorts of policy about really important things, right? They do a lot of the social welfare spending. They're the ones who design local social welfare programs, they administer, Medicare and so on in their states. They administer all sorts of community health programs, housing programs, etc. And if there is not a working class perspective represented in the halls of state legislature, where people are debating how to solve the housing crisis, how to solve the healthcare crisis, then the policies that are passed are inevitably going to favor an elite and wealthy, the viewpoints of the elite and the upper class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I thought this one was really, and I want to add, it sort of highlights something that we noticed. Andy Lee Roth, who's one of the other co-editors of this year's book, has written about how the news media have kind of an events bias. They're biased towards reporting on things that are events rather than reporting on conditions, right? So they report something special that happened today or happened yesterday, but they don't do a very good job of reporting on what happens every single day. And as a result, the realities of class in America are sort of invisible because it's a condition, not an event. And what I loved about this story is it sort of highlighted the huge inequities in political power that flow from and reflect the massive inequities in economic power that exist in this country.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's,
If you're interested, all of the stories are available to read. The summaries are available to read on our website, projectcensored.org.
but they don't come with this nifty cover.
Right. But if you're curious, I'm putting you on the spot, but do you have a favorite or a memorable story from one of your students that didn't make it to one of the lists?
Well,
Was it
actually, yours,
mine?
it was yours. Yes, Shealeigh, actually, yours is one of the.
That's why I asked.
Do you want to talk about the story that you researched? So I guess I should say that, so yeah, the way that it works is students find a story that was reported in an independent news outlet, so not owned by a corporation, usually a not-for-profit or small community news outlet, or in a small independent outlet. And then they have to go and look at the corporate news media to find out whether that story or something related to that story had been reported in the corporate press, right? So it requires a bit of research. It's not just, oh, they find a cool story that they think is really interesting that they've never heard of. They have to document that, in fact, it hadn't ever been reported. And then, after they write up their summary, it is submitted to Project Censored. Project Censored does another fact check on it, puts it on a ballot, and as I said, it first goes out, it has 2 rounds of voting. First goes out to everybody who's involved, all the students, all the faculty, the staff of Project Censored vote on it, and then the judges vote on it. And you know, we don't have any control over how the judges vote. And Shealeigh had a story, and researched a story, which I thought was really great. And I told her at the time, I thought this was going to get some votes, and it just didn't get the votes. So do you want to talk about the story that didn't make it
I don't
into the
remember
book?
all the details, but it was about Raytheon, which is
Yes,
a weapons
the defense
manufacturer,
contractor, yeah.
sponsoring a teen math competition. I do remember. I remember it was like my headline was Raytheon prepares for math destruction.
It was a very clever headline.
And I was like, come on. But yeah, I mean, those were the kinds of stories that I was like surprised that I was so interested in. Like, and also just like I was looking at like independent news sources that I had never heard of before. I mean, those were like the early days of my journalism education, and I was like, I thought I knew how to read the news. And I took that class, and that was kind of like my introduction to Project Censored, understanding sort of like, you know, the tools for reading the news, understanding who's making the news, who's controlling the messaging, why is it told like this, why is it being framed this way, and I think, yeah, like the you know, militarization of big tech obviously was even at that point when I was in college in 2020, 2021, we were already thinking about that, and obviously and Project Censored has done now a 10-part series on the militarization of AI and big tech, and so it's something that we've continued now to see represented by students just like me, who have investigated stories like that. But yeah, I don't remember all the details, but I just like, I remember like I don't even remember who originally reported. It might have been Truth Out.
It might have been Truth Out. I think that's right.
But yeah, like just comparing it to like the Scripps National Spelling Bee, but with very evil intentions to recruit like, you know, teen geniuses for, you know, the possibility to work for, you know, Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, and and there were, you know, I remember too, like there were a lot of protests at like Tufts University of Raytheon and those companies who were at job fairs.
Right.
That was included in the summary as well, but yeah, I was bummed that that didn't get those that year. But I stuck around.
Yeah, you stuck around. And now,
I stuck around.
Now you're running the whole show. So, I mean, at some point we should stop and does anyone have any questions at all about anything you've said so far? Or anything in the book, having to do with the list of underreported stories? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious how you are defining like underreported. I guess you reference like independent media groups that you will like lead students to like look at some of their articles and whatnot, but I'm curious if there's like a threshold of when it becomes reported or not.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually curious how you sort of teach it to your students.
So, we have a rule of thumb, right, which is, you know, if it's being mentioned in every one of the big national news outlets, you know, Washington Post, USA Today, New York Times, CNN, ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, then it's then unless there's some aspect of the story that isn't being reported, that's really crucial, that's being overlooked, then it's probably, we use a very violent language, dead. It's, it's killed.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the things that can happen, which is very unfortunate for students, is you can nominate the story, and at the time you nominate the story, it hasn't gotten a very much corporate media attention. And then it can be voted into the list by the judges, but in the summer we do one last check on how much attention, one last round of research to try to find out, using news databases that probably all of you are familiar with, like Lexis, Uni, and Google News, and ProQuest, major newspapers. And then there are times when we find that it has subsequently, in between when it was submitted and when we put the book together, it got some attention. And I can think of a few cases where that happened, where the independent news media reported it first, but then by the time we were trying to put the book together, it had gotten too much attention, and then we had to kick it off the list because it got too much attention. So it is sort of a rule of thumb. One report in the New York Times is not enough to necessarily kill the story for our purposes. I can give an example if you want. So there was a great story by an independent environmental news site. I think it was Manga Bay, but don't quote me on that. But it was about how Europe's demand for wood chips, which they used to burn. They burnt as a source of renewable energy, right? So Europe has these mandates that in the EU, in certain countries in the EU, that a certain percentage of their power has to come from renewable energy. Well, one source of renewable energy, according to the EU's definition, was power plants fueled by wood chips. And this story was about how forests in North Carolina and South Carolina were being chopped down and sent over to Europe to burn as a renewable resource, as a renewable source of power in Europe. Well, there was very little attention to this outside of these environmental outlets, but the New York Times Magazine actually did not a cover story, but a feature story in the magazine about how this trend was affecting North Carolina and the forests in North Carolina. But that was it. They published one story in the New York Times Magazine, which does get a lot of attention, but there was no follow-up, and no mention of it anywhere else in the New York Times. We concluded that was not. That was still an underreported story.
Yeah, it's sort of a mixed feeling when it gets covered in the meantime.
Right.
Well, great, it's getting attention.
Yeah, no, you want it to get covered, but you feel bad for the students who did the work to dig it up and so on.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Any other questions? Yeah. Well, maybe we could talk a little bit about some.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
What do you guys, your thoughts on ground news or platforms like ground news, if you're familiar with it, kind of like trying to do like a comprehensive algorithmic aggregation of news that identifies biases and also like underreporting. You feel like that is successful, or
You want to say anything?
I'm not familiar with ground news.
I mean, I think that those news there's different sites like that are news aggregators, but they don't have their own reporters, right? So, I use various kinds of news aggregators to find stories and to become aware of stories, but they're not employing their own reporters, and that's the difference, I think, between a site like that and, say, the New Lead, or here in Chicago, In These Times Magazine, which is a magazine that I subscribe to and love, or up in Wisconsin, The Progressive. They're hiring people, they're paying reporters to go out and dig into stories, to do actual reporting, to interview people and gather facts, or to pore through bunches of government documents. And then these aggregators are like, sort of seizing on that content and then sharing it. So, I remember 20 years ago there was a huge debate about aggregators like Huffington Post, because news outlets, corporate and independent, complained that Huffington Post was stealing their content and selling ads against it, and that was hurting their ability to pay their reporters, right? I was at a meeting, I remember it was in a hotel in downtown, where the editor of the Chicago Tribune was angrily yelling at the head of HuffPost Chicago about how you're stealing our content, you're stealing our content. So I have mixed feelings about aggregators, period, because I don't, they're not necessarily helping actual news outlets, to survive. And as Shealeigh alluded, we have a problem in this country with news deserts. There are growing areas of the country where there are no news outlets. There are several counties, especially in the West, where there are zero, even weekly newspapers.
Yeah.
So that means people don't know what their city council is doing, don't know what the local school board is doing, have no idea how much their mayor is spending. It's kind of a, because who would monitor that? Who would report on that? Usually a newspaper. So yeah, I have mixed feelings about it.
I have another question in terms of how, again, not just the quantity of stories, but the framing of the story. I mean, you guys alluded to this, but just, for example, data centers covered a lot. The framing's starting to shift, but, in terms of, and specifically, I guess, with corporate or legacy versus independent, if I'm just curious about how the framing behind stories also takes into account, whether or not that's counted as underreported based on who's being covered and stuff.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, yeah, I mean, that's, something, we talked about that earlier, that something can be covered by a corporate outlet and still be considered eligible because it's framed differently by an independent source. We have a resource on our website called Beyond Fact Checking, the Frame Checking Guide. And so if you're not familiar sort of with the idea of a news frame, it's so that guide really kind of talks about, I wrote it with my colleague Andy Lee Roth, who is another co-editor of State of the Free Press. Media places a really great emphasis on fact checking, which is really important. And as a means of sort of countering mis and disinformation. But something can be factual and still misleading because of the way that it's framed. And that's something that particularly we are on the lookout when we read summaries that we get from students. A lot of media literacy experts or scholars will tell you that lateral reading is the way out of, figuring out how to verify a source and combat misinformation. But I think lateral reading, which is sort of just being on a website, clicking out and visiting different sources to sort of verify a lot of the claims that you're reading. That's lateral reading. Lateral reading doesn't really allow you to detect news slant, which is, framing that, of reports to promote sort of one-sided perspectives and reduce these complex realities of the stories we're reading in the top 25, top 12 this year, to sort of these simplistic narratives. So framing is a really big thing I think that we pay attention to, because I think especially even in this year's book, there are plenty of stories where it's like you said, where it gets a little bit of a mention in New York Times or Washington Post, or I'm trying to think of an example of in Junk this year, we talk about censoring of pro-Palestinian activists on college campuses. Now that was widely reported on many broadcast news outlets, covered in the New York Times, Washington Post, but often covered in terms of like outside agitator, conspiracy theories. These are different quality of reporting that doesn't sort of hold the administration censoring these students and punishing them by threatening to take away their visas and deportation threats and academic discipline, didn't adequately cover those implications and consequences as thoroughly as it did some of the more, I think, conspiratorial ideas about what was driving these protests on college campuses and who might be responsible for leading them, when really it was history repeating itself, students standing up to injustices abroad. But that's one example of like something framing differently. That wasn't in our top 12, but it was something that we talked about in the book, is like the quality of reporting varies, and it's something you have to really pay attention to, and it's really easy to miss because framing is designed to be very subtle.
I mean, framing is just something that Shealeigh wrote in this guide, which I do think is really valuable. Is it can come down to who is interviewed by the journalist when they're reporting on the story, and so many of the stories about the the pro-Palestinian demonstrations and encampments that we saw, especially last year. So much of the coverage only consulted university administrators, people from law enforcement.
Right.
No, they never even bothered usually to talk to the students who were actually out there demonstrating.
Yeah.
I saw several articles like that in both the New York Times and the Washington Post, where they would report on this issue and report that Students for Justice in Palestine had been banned from campus. And I know it's happened in campuses here in Chicago. I think at DePaul, the Students for Justice in Palestine banned. All throughout Florida, this student organization kicked off campus, but there was no kind of, or very minimal quotations from the students who were members of that organization. That just seems like a dereliction of journalistic duty, right? If journalists are supposed to cover both sides of a conflict, in a controversy, or both sides of a controversial issue, not to talk to the students who are actually involved.
Yeah. I mean, it's like that's something that you see a lot, is like using sources that have bureaucratic statuses instead of community members, and I think that's what's important again about local reporting, which does tell community stories with community perspectives, which is what we deserve to be able to read. Yeah.
So you mentioned junk, and I don't think that the audience knows what you're referring to. So in the book, every year, the largest chapter, it consists of the list of a summary, the list of most underreported stories and summaries of those stories and an analysis of the coverage that they've got. But there are other chapters in the book, and one of them, which is everybody's favorite chapter to write, is junk food news.
Yeah.
Can you describe what junk food news is?
Yeah.
And what were the top junk stories of the last year?
Okay, yeah, so we, it's a term that Project Censored coined to describe reporting that entertains and distracts the public instead of informing the public. And when I first learned about junk food news, I was like, oh no, like,
It's
I
my
love
favorite.
that.
My favorite
I love
story.
reading about the housewives. Like, don't take that away from me. And I think this chapter specifically, it does not finger wag or tell you that you shouldn't read it. I think it's just to make you sort of recognize overrepresentation of celebrity news, entertainment news, and what is maybe, again, outside of the frame in terms of like what you're missing out on. And this year we paired, and it's sort of, that is sort of the format of every junk chapter, is it's like, you know, in these different sections we pair stories that are sort of related, where it's one got really like a lot of attention because it was concerning celebrities or entertainment or some kind of sensationalized pop culture story, and then stories that were maybe underrepresented about, you know, many things that we see in the top censored story list. But the this junk chapter, we talked about some of the harm, the long-term pervasive harm of DOJ cuts, cuts to the Department of Education. My section was, I mentioned, about the federal government and colleges and universities across the country censoring and punishing students for engaging in pro-Palestinian activism. And there was a lot there. Obviously, Tufts grad student Rameza Ozkirk was abducted by ICE agents for publishing an article that she wrote a year before, which criticized the university for its ties to Israel. She was detained in Louisiana for 6 weeks. The Independent Florida Alligator broke a story about the university collaborating with ICE to enforce immigration policies on campus. And corporate media, again, I mentioned this earlier, pushed these sort of conspiracy theories about why these students were on campus protesting, to just discredit the nature of the protest, and neglected to cover visa cancellations, deportation threats, academic discipline, that created a chilling effect for student journalists covering pro-Palestinian protests. And we paired this story in my section with Rachel Zegler and Gal Gadot promoting Snow White, which was a controversy, I guess, because Rachel Zegler posted on Twitter supporting a free Palestine. Variety wrote an entire article about how this put her Israeli co-star Gal Gadot in danger. You know, this kind of framing casts, you know, pro-Palestinian activism and support as misguided, disruptive, controversial, and it legitimized like a lot of the Trump administration's actions against, you know, students on campuses. So we talked a lot about a lot of those things, but I think, you know, the important thing to recognize in all of that, obviously, is Rachel Zegler is protected more so than a lot of the students whose stories we will never hear, because that is, I think, part of that cycle of the chilling effect against, especially you know, student journalists in those situations. But yeah, junk explores the stories that we indulge in, the entertainment stories that we indulge in, which is great and no problem with that, but it just shows you maybe just where to look for other stories that you may be missing out on because they're not represented as frequently in the corporate media.
Yeah, the back.
Hi, I am here with my DePaul students. And this may
Wonderful.
be-
Oh, well, thank you for bringing
so
them
much.
all out.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah, I just thought this was such an important topic because I myself don't know what to tell them exactly, and this may be an overly broad question, but how do we know who to trust, where to go, I know this is huge.
That's huge.
Where to go, where to look, you know, help us out here. Yeah, I don't have advice for them. I mean, someone knows a lot more than me about this stuff.
Wow. Well, that is a great question,
Yeah.
and you know, because are your students journalism students or
No,
no?
I'm sorry.
Okay, no. So I was going to say if you know.
Don't be
you know,
sorry.
my students are, a number of my students, aspire to careers in journalism, and they internalize this idea that the only news outlets that you can trust, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, maybe NPR, that those are the most reliable sources of information. And one of the benefits of, I think, this exercise of looking at what's getting overlooked is you realize that that they're not necessarily the most trustworthy source of information
That's
about
all I
everything.
know. So I need your help.
But what I will say is they're biased, but not in the way that right-wing critics and fans of Donald Trump say they are, right? There isn't like a conspiracy to slant the news, that's being run by the editors or the publishers of these news outlets. I don't think that that's what's happening. They're responding in a rational way to like economic pressures, right? To deadline pressures and so on that push them into dependence on official sources, for example. Like one reason you won't get a lot of critical reporting from reporters who are stationed in the White House is that their whole job depends on them having access to people in the administration. And if they are too critical of the people in the administration can punish them just by cutting off their access. And we saw it happen earlier this year when Donald Trump booted the Associated Press, one of the most respected news cooperatives, wire services in the country. They publish the guide that is the Bible for every journalist, the AP style guide that every journalist uses as a guide for how to spell things and so on and so forth in news articles. He kicked them out of the White House press corps over what? Does anyone remember?
It was Poland, right?
It was they refused in the style guide to rename the body of water south of Texas the Gulf of America. They insist, the AP style guide still calls it what it has always been known as, the Gulf of Mexico. And because they wouldn't change, because the AP would not change it, he booted them out of the White House. That shows you the power of access. So I think things like dependence on powerful sources, dependence on advertising subsidy, all of those things skew the corporate press in a particular direction. That doesn't mean there aren't great reporters with integrity, committed to factual and accurate reporting, working for those outlets. There are even reporters like that working for Rupert Murdoch, working for the Wall Street Journal. I actually think the Wall Street Journal does some excellent reporting on economic news. Why? Because investors want accurate information. They don't want to make decisions about what to invest in based on propaganda and ideologically biased information. They want accurate news. So there are, I think none of those big corporate, national, opinion-leading news outlets is going to deliberately distort facts, but they will overlook particular facts. And that's why I think it's important to teach your students to supplement their news diet. I mean, I know most of my students' news diet is like whatever comes up on TikTok. Whatever comes up on TikTok that day, right? But to supplement their news diet, if they are just reading the New York Times, the Washington Post, or God forbid, the Chicago Tribune, which is a shadow of its former self. When I first arrived in this area, it was a very good newspaper. It's been taken over by Alden Global Capital, which is a vulture hedge fund that just is sucking them dry and is utterly destroyed. I mean, it is a shadow of its former self. But like whatever their main source of news, they should supplement that source with looking at independent news media.
And what independent news sources?
Here in Chicago, in these Times
Block Club,
magazine,
Block Club
Block
Chicago.
Club, ProPublica, which is, I think a lot of the not-for-profit foundation-funded news operations are really good. Shealeigh, you should say.
I was just gonna say too, like, we have a list of comprehensive teaching guides and classroom exercises on our website, projectcensored.org, that teach students sort of how news is produced and how, you know, these narratives are formed and how things can be suppressed or spun. We have those teaching guides available, downloadable, free of charge. We have past chapters of books on our website as well. But we have a lot of teaching guides concerning bins, but also framing and
and lists of independent news outlets.
Exactly.
that
We
you
have
can
a
consult.
pretty comprehensive list of independent news sources that we consult all the time and are usually represented, you know, in our top censored list. We also have like zines available on our website that talk about critical media literacy, and we have a radio show too that breaks down a lot of these topics with, you know, media scholars, journalists, different people that really know their stuff and know sort of, you know, how important independent journalism is, so yeah, those are a lot of resources that are. It's a radio show on KPFA. It's called the Project Censored.
Yeah.
It's called the Project Censored show, but it's available anywhere you would listen to podcasts. So
It's
Hosted,
originated out of KPFA, which
Yeah.
is a radio station in Berkeley, California. That's part of the Pacifica Radio Network. But the guy who actually hosts the show, or there's now two co-hosts. One is in Ithaca, New York. The other one is in Baltimore, Maryland. So they're not actually out in San Francisco anymore. But I think it's been picked. It's on like 40 different stations around the country. And it's also available as a podcast, so you can download it. And now they have a video podcast.
They're on
as
our
well.
YouTube channel
So
as well.
so if you go and look at the Project Censored YouTube channel, you can find the podcast.
Yeah, I think those resources, you know, in addition to looking at those news sources available on our website, those tools might be helpful because they are truly lessons and classroom exercises built for high school and college students. So.
And if I can add one more suggestion of sources, a lot of great journalists who have lost their jobs at newspapers, magazines where they used to work, or news sites where they used to work, have now started their own Substacks. There's, like for example, one writer who I follow is Ken Klippenstein. And he's been reporting a lot about Trump's new National Security Memorandum number 7. Has anyone ever heard of that? This is the one that basically identifies people who are associated with Antifa as domestic terrorists and orders the Justice Department to begin investigations into people who have anti-American and anti-Christian views. It is truly chilling, and Ken Klippenstein got, because he has still from his reporting days for I think it was at the Intercept. He has these connections with people in government. He got a memo leaked. So there are those individual reporters like Ken Klippenstein and Lee Fang. I could give you a list of a bunch of people who I follow. They do some great work, and they need the support. So even if you can give just $5 to these reporters, it can help.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? I know we've been chatting for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Couple more questions? Anyone? Do you want us to talk about the other chapters of the book?
I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned big tech. What stories about big tech are getting some attention, in particular with regards to what's been touted as artificial intelligence? Anything?
So we last book, we did a story about the security problems with AI, which I thought was a really interesting story. And it was some specialized tech news outlet that originally reported it. But what it suggested is, first of all, that people are using AI all the time at work. I'm sure this is going to come as a shock. You're shocked, I tell you, that people are using that people are using AI. I know all you students are just shocked that people are using AI for research. But people are using AI to do research at work, at their jobs. And this was an article examining all of the security problems created by people using AI that was not proprietary and so on, because it could potentially lead to sensitive client information, for example, being put on AI, where there are ways to actually induce AI to reproduce the ways that it's been trained. So you could get the data that had been uploaded to the AI if you were so inclined. And the article pointed out that the U.S. Congress doesn't allow people to use AI, that the National Archives has banned the use of AI, right? At the same time, of course, now the current administration is all gung-ho about trying to prevent people from regulating AI, and yet the Congress and the National Archives and other branches of the U.S. government actually ban the use of AI because it is such a security risk. So that's one that I would point to. I think that was from last year. It was last year. So it was last year's book. So it was State of the Free Press 2025 that included that story.
Yeah. Quick overview too of this year's book. Our number one story was about ICE soliciting social media surveillance contracts to identify critics. That was a story by The Intercept, also covered by Common Dreams and The Independent. And yeah, U.S. Immigration and Custom Enforcement plans to hire private contractors to monitor and locate negative social media discussion about the federal agency. That was one. Meta undertakes sweeping crackdown of Facebook and Instagram posts at Israel's request. That was our number 4 story this year. That was out of DropSite News. And yeah, that was taken down posts that are critical of Israel or even vaguely supportive of Palestinians. Yeah, DropSite characterized Meta's response to the Israeli government's takedown request campaign as the largest mass censorship operation in modern history. Pretty chilling story. But yeah, another one, our number 6 story, Amazon and Walmart use hostile surveillance technology against warehouse employees. We're seeing big tech stories and AI way represented in the summaries that we get from students. And I think that's just to the way that we consume media is so different. I think young people are starting to understand that they're using AI even without realizing it every single day. And it's making them very curious about ways in which that is employed in other areas of life beyond education. I think those stories are also the ones I'm most drawn to, as evidenced by the story I chose when I was a student. But it's chilling. The Intercept does great reporting. Common Dreams does great big tech reporting. And yeah, I think you're right.
He used to work for
The Intercept and DropSite, who also helped contribute to this year's Media Democracy in Action chapter. They do great big tech reporting as well.
So maybe to wrap up, I will just talk about
please.
these last 2 chapters in the book, because the book is there's several chapters. One is called Media Democracy in Action. And that's the place in the book where, after everybody gets depressed by learning about all the really alarming stories that have been overlooked by the corporate media, where the project highlights organizations, activists, and independent media outlets that are helping to kind of push back and resist. So this year, the organizations and groups that we highlighted were Drop Site News, Media Movement Media Alliance, which is an alliance of independent media outlets and independent media producers across the country, Consortium News, which is a long-standing independent news outlet, Freedom of the Press Foundation, which is a group that fights for the First Amendment rights of reporters and fights against censorship in the courts, Indigenous Media Freedom Alliance. Those were some of the organizations that were spotlighted. And then, do you want to talk about the final chapter, which is a really great, I think, addition to this year's book?
My colleague, Reagan Haney, she's our social media manager. We were trying to decide what our special chapter 6 chapter might be this year. Reagan became very interested in how to teach people on Instagram and TikTok, as you mentioned, about critical media literacy, which, I mean, you mentioned, people kind of come across news on TikTok or on Instagram, and it's not the final, destination, but it's a really good entry point for learning about some of these things on a surface level and then investigating it other places, which we've talked about. But this chapter, it's called Understanding the Digital Public Square, Critical Media Literacy Guide to Infographics. And we talk about how to be a responsible media maker, but also how to understand messaging in terms of, what might be misleading uses of AI, misleading, sensationalized sort of how are these claims, what emotions are these claims appealing to, what kind of reaction is it trying to get out of you, which usually means you should be maybe a little bit suspicious. But yeah, following up on who is making these posts and why. There was an infographic that went viral last year that was an AI image of a camp in Rafah. It was all eyes on Rafah. I'm sure you've probably seen it if you were on Instagram at the time. And people shared it. And it was a great, I think, show of support for displaced Palestinians. Unfortunately, the people who made it were making money in a really twisted way as a result of these posts, and I think just even the use of AI was a detractor from art that was being made by Palestinians, drawing attention. I think that is the entry point piece that's really important to recognize. Is it's so good to pay attention to these movements and these things that are taking place online, but the learning can't stop there. And I think that's what's hard sometimes about the infographic space, is that you share a post and maybe you forget about it and you move on. And this one kind of just talks about what to be on the lookout when you're consuming that kind of media on social media, and specifically then to how to apply that if you want to become a media maker yourself and how to do that responsibly. So it's a really fun chapter to write and explore, and it's a graphic chapter, so it was designed by Reagan Haney and Kate Horgan, and yeah, it talks about how to be responsible with your activism. So it was really fun to write.
Well, thank you all. If nobody has any more questions, I really want to thank you for coming out. And let me just say, if you are at all interested, intrigued, we are always looking for students to research validated independent news stories that can be nominated to be included in next year's book. So who should they contact, Shealeigh?
Yeah, well, you can reach out to me, Shealeigh, at projectcensored.org. I am always available to take any questions, but you can visit projectcensored.org, look at some of our dispatch series to get an idea of some of the stuff that we cover, which is a a series we do on the intersection of media and politics. There's a list of compiled VINs that we've done in the past. But you can check all of that out. We have a classroom page that has all kinds of educator and teaching guide resources. Yeah, definitely check out our nomination story piece at the very bottom of our website. We're always happy to hear if you think that a story is underreported and you'd like it to be featured in a future book or anything like that. Yeah. So
Right.
thank you so much
Thank
for
you for
coming.
your attention. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
And there's bumper stickers.
There's bumper stickers.